This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Well, welcome to this special mini Primitive Culture. We are live at the Albert Hall in London. I'm here with Clara Cook. I'm here with Amy Nelson. I'm here with Lee Hutchison. I'm here with Tony Black. I'm here with Tony Robinson. And we've got a few other guests lurking around who may or may not be making their contributions known. And we've been enjoying a very special screening of Star Trek Beyond with live orchestra. What did you all make of it?
Yeah, it was wonderful. I always love the music they play when they go into Yorktown. So to hear that live was quite special. I'm hoping the Beastie Boys will be out on the second half.
Yeah, that's what we're looking forward to. We've already had Simon Pegg on stage so far during the performance. We're here at the interval in the bar, just sort of soaking up the atmosphere and chilling out before the second half. And then we're going to go in and see the rest of the film. I mean, I don't know about you guys. For me, this is up until yesterday when we saw, because some of us were here yesterday and we saw Star Trek 09. Beyond is the only one of these films that actually worked for me the first time I saw it in the cinema. I really love this film. It's the one that kind of really gels for me. And I think even seeing it again, it's the one that kind of works the best. I did enjoy 09 yesterday. I was saying to some of these guys, I enjoyed it more than I ever have before. But definitely for me, this is the one that seems to kind of really work as a film. What do you guys think? What are your sort of feelings on the Kelvin Timeline?
Well, I love both of them. I think they're so good. And I was telling you, Duncan, I'm like, Beyond wouldn't be as good if we didn't have 09. I just loved 09. And it was interesting to see one right after the other. So, like, the music, it just sort of seems as the same. But watching it this time, I really noticed, like, the beginning of Beyond, I'm like, this music is different. And I'd never picked that up before because the same theme, you know, is played in both of them. But that beginning, I was like, oh, yeah, this is the one with Crawl. And it just all came back. And just the difference, the smallest differences of the music really set up the movies so differently. I really, really loved the music and how much different it is live.
Yeah, you've got such a great podcast voice, Amy. It's only in person, right? You have anyway, but just like, yeah, it's just a good podcast voice. We're all going to sound rubbish now compared to. Yeah, it's a great film. It's still continually a great film. I think the orchestra really does add something to it. I think it just. I go back and forth as to whether or not I like this score better than Star Trek 09, which obviously we saw yesterday. But I don't know. I think there's just something about this film as well. I love that. I realise watching these two films, thematically, the whole thing really is about Kirk's journey from being a boy who's lost to a man who's lost and happens to be going through this journey of becoming a captain and becoming his father essentially, or what his father would have been. And it really, really comes alive when you watch them back to back, essentially, with what you do. And I know Into Darkness is also involved, but it kind of, these two, Star Trek and this one, Beyond, really match up in that way. And it's really coming out to me as we watch it about just how much it's all Kirk. It's all Kirk's story. More than the old films, in a way. Maybe that's wrong. I don't know what you guys think, but it feels more acute in the reboots than it does in the old ones.
Well, I wonder whether that's partly because Kirk is so different in these films. And I think that's one of the things that I always had a real problem with about 09 is I was just like, this is not Captain Kirk as I understand him, because he's a different person. And I get that was the idea, was to give him a different backstory that kind of turned him into this. Weirdly, what I felt they were trying to do is they were trying to turn him into this kind of, the womanizing, troubled character that people sort of want to imagine that Captain Kirk was somehow, someone with no respect for the rules, someone who was totally reckless and so on. And so they kind of had to put this sort of twist into the timeline in order to get that character out there. And that was what I always sort of struggled with a bit with that film. Yesterday, seeing it for whatever it is, like the 4th or 5th or 6th time, it sort of gelled for me a bit more. But I think maybe, you know, Amy, you were saying to me yesterday, you couldn't get Beyond if you hadn't had '09. I think for me, somehow, Beyond makes me like '09 more because I sort of see where it's going, and I can kind of, you know, by this point, I'm much more on board with these characters. I'm kind of willing to accept that they are who they say they are. I think that was a big part of it. I mean, I was wondering for you, Tony, you know, working on all this stuff to do with the fan films and so on. Pardon me, the first time I saw 2009 at the cinema was I was like, well, is this really any different for a fan film where other people are, you know, imposters are pretending to be Captain Kirk or whoever, and it's not William Shatner, it's not Leonard Nimoy, but it's just we've got this massive budget and, you know, better actors and so on. I mean, is that a part of it, just that kind of recasting and the kind of challenge when you're very familiar with a certain person in a role of really accepting someone else playing that role?
Well, I think the difference between this movie and what a fan movie is that for those who want to act in fan movies, they really want to live out their lives vicariously through the lives of their characters. And
silence your Tony.
That's right. I'm about to spill the beans on the greatest secret in Starfleet, and this woman keeps interrupting. What does she? I think she's a Klingon insurgent. Okay, so what I was really going to say was that from the fan movie point of view, people who want to live out their lives vicariously through their characters, and they desire to do that, and they do it for the love of being part of the world of Star Trek, being part of that environment. Actors are actors, paid for their jobs, and they take them on according to, you know, their contracts and their scripts. And in the case of Star Trek 2009, Into Darkness and Beyond, these guys are doing a phenomenal job. They've got huge boots to fill, and they do it superbly. They absolutely do it. Coming back to the fandom side of things, Beyond is written by a fan. Simon Pegg is clearly the ultimate fan, and if it wasn't for him, perhaps this film never would have been made. It had so much troubles in its beginning. Simon picked up the ropes and went with it.
Welcome back to Primitive Culture. We are now in a pub in Knightsbridge after leaving the concert, which ended on a very dramatic, explosive note, didn't it, with the soundtrack. The name of this pub is The Bunch of Grapes, which is not the most original name for a pub. It's traditional. And it is a part. Yeah, it is a part of our culture.
It's a primitive culture.
It's primitive culture. And so I wanted to ask all of you here a little bit about the music of today's film. How do you think it compared to the music of some of the older films, some of the more original films?
I have to say, I feel like seeing these films live and seeing the music performed live. Sorry, that was an interruption for some of Amy's very fancy snacks coming in British. During our conversation. A very British, well, allegedly a very British snack that she's ordered.
I don't know what it is. So
We're not quite sure. We're not quite sure how to identify it, but you know, maybe someone can scan it at a later date. But my feeling about the music of these films was always that it was so kind of bombastic. And Amy, you were saying you felt like seeing the two films back to back. Initially, you thought the music was all the same, but then you started to notice the differences between them. I felt like I really appreciated it more seeing it performed live. And, you know, it is very bombastic. It is quite loud. It's quite kind of intense. But at the same time, there are quieter moments. There are more reflective moments. And maybe those moments you don't necessarily notice the music unless it's, you know, obviously if you're listening to the soundtrack, but when you're watching the film, you're kind of wrapped up in the story and so on, and maybe you're not really thinking about the music. But actually, I was interested to see there was more kind of variety there than maybe I've been expecting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely agree. Like the times, I mean, when you say bombastic, loud and annoying, right? We know the Beastie Boys and that from Beyond. But those quieter moments, the juxtaposition between that obviously just makes the film that much more powerful and that much more, like, I was getting teary-eyed in so many more spots. And I can't even tell you how many times I've seen Beyond. But, like, I was getting teary-eyed just because the emotion of it all. And, of course, watching it with a bunch of fans is always 10 times better because people are laughing at the right spot and they understand the nuances of the dialogue so much better. And then to have the orchestra performing live just makes it that much more enjoyable. definitely you recognize those spots.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it was quite an emotional experience. Lots of people were quite moved by it. Tony, I know you were telling us, you had a tear in your eye at more than one occasion, I think, during that show.
Okay, so, yeah, some things send me easily, but, I mean, after that show today, there's a full orchestra playing the end theme, and we all know the notes, and the voice comes on and says space, the final frontier. In fact, I think that phrase was spoken by the main actors. Each spoke a sentence, space, the final. But anyway, the music soared into action, and the main Star Trek theme came on. And for some reason, I just teared up. And it's just simply because of the pressure of the music and the atmosphere in the auditorium, and everybody is tuning in. And it's amazing how euphoric music can make you do that. I've noticed music on other movies that have that effect, whether it's minor keys or major keys or whatever it is. But these composers really know how to evoke emotion in you, and I guess that's a good thing. And the Star Trek theme we've heard for years. I mean, it's a very familiar theme. But there's something about a live setting, and there's something about a huge orchestra blaring that out. You just sit there pinned to your seat, and you can't help but be moved by it. And I certainly was moved by it. I sound a bit wimpish, Tony teared up at the Star Trek theme, but hey, I don't know if there wasn't a lot of other people in the room that it wasn't affected the other way as well. So there you go. That's my tuppence worth, as they say.
No, I think you definitely weren't the only one. And I think it's partly what Amy was talking about being in a fan audience, being in an event like that, that everyone is very much on the same page. And I think maybe with Beyond it particularly resonates because, as we were talking about earlier, this is a film very much made by a fan. And we had Simon Pegg on stage talking about how much it meant to him, in his career to have written this film. And that's one of the things that appealed to me when I first saw this film at the cinema, was it felt like it was written by someone who really cared about Star Trek. And yes, there were kind of the in-jokes and the references and so on, but they didn't feel like cheap jokes. They felt like it was someone who was really kind of trying to tie it into the kind of broader Star Trek story. And I suppose I found it quite emotional, that bit at the end where they each speak a section of that, whatever you call it, that kind of mission statement or whatever, because I don't know what the word is for it, because we've heard Kirk saying it, we've heard Picard, we've heard Spock, we've heard in Enterprise they did that, they had the various captains saying it, but I suppose it also ties in very much with Beyond, to the kind of theme of the film of this, you can't break a stick in a bundle, this kind of teamwork and coming together, and the fact that they have everyone coming together and saying that at the end, is a kind of quite a poignant moment, and particularly seeing it in a kind of fan environment, in a sense, where everyone's there for the same reason, everyone's there to enjoy it. It really kind of packs more of a punch somehow. So
one of the things I noticed was that the music to Beyond, and actually any of the new reboot movies, it sounds more threatening to me. Like, it sounds more dramatic. Like you said, the sort of bombastic, the beats and the shouting. Unlike a lot of the other Star Trek movie soundtracks, which are more sort of aspirational, slightly more romantic. You can sort of see that they go along with the stories of ships sailing and, adventures. But the Beyond, but also all the other reboots, they're very, very aggressive and very dramatic. And I think that's because our nature of Star Trek and our idea of Star Trek has changed. If you think about Discovery, we have a more of a cynical and sort of perhaps darker look of the world now. The television is much more cynical, there's more cynical stories. And there is this kind of aspirational message in Star Trek. More recent Star Trek has had a darker theme, and so the music has to kind of fit that. The bit in Star Trek Beyond that actually affects me the most is the destruction of the Enterprise. So the sort of hive-like, bee-like ships coming back and cutting the neck of the Enterprise off, and because the Enterprise itself is very much a symbol of a home in space, and they're out in the deepest, darkest reaches of space, and they have no starbase nearby and no planet. The thing that grounds them and keeps them together is the actual ship itself. So the destruction of the ship, every time I see this movie, always affects me. And what I've noticed is that the music gets very soft at that point, almost as if you're sort of witnessing like the death of a great animal, or you're witnessing real tragedy happen. And the real sort of loud, bombastic music, it kind of comes before that. That's the real threat, the real banging, A lot of drums, a lot of horns, a lot of violent, aggressive violins, and then it gets very quiet as the Enterprise sort of floats apart. And especially also as Kirk is taking off in the rescue pod and he's watching the Enterprise crash, the disc of the Enterprise crash into the planet, and that look on his face, and as a captain, that would have a real psychological impact.
It's an echo, I think, as well of the first film. I mean, it's interesting seeing them day by day, back to back. You get the same thing with the destruction of the Kelvin, and I suppose this film is very much, again, sort of, I mean, it's interesting skipping out the middle part of that trilogy in a sense, because you do see much more the connections between these two films that maybe have more in common. And you see that kind of style again, I think, with the destruction of the Kelvin in that film. You've had all this drama, it's been very loud, it's been very kind of energetic, and then there's a point where it's almost like kind of washed out because the emotion is kind of overwhelming and the music does become quieter and the kind of the audio is muted effectively as a way for you to kind of, I don't know, sort of take in the emotional drama in a way and kind of absorb that. And I think that's a trick that definitely gets repeated again in this film as well. And maybe that's quite nice for a kind of respite for a film that, you know, because these films are very action-packed, they are very kind of frenetic. I mean, even this one is very much a kind of action romp. You know, the pace is pretty relentless. It kind of hits the ground running and it keeps going bang, 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 bang. The reason I feel that it works better for me is that it sort of feels to me like it's all going in the same direction. It's not just disconnected set pieces, which sometimes I feel with these films, the emphasis is too much on the set piece. So like the monsters on the ice planet and beyond. When I first saw that at the cinema, that really bothered me. And even yesterday, I kind of cringed at that scene because I just feel like it's not recognisably Star Trek to me. That's very generic. That could be Star Wars. It could be any kind of sci-fi action series. And it's just there to get a monster in and to have a bit of excitement for 5 minutes and then move on to the next thing. And but what I felt with this film is it does feel very much like everything is kind of moving the plot forward in some way, and there's a real kind of forward momentum. And I guess, the music plays a big part of that as well.
So one of the things I noticed that when you see an orchestra playing a soundtrack live to the film, you can really see how an orchestra actually makes the film, basically. I mean, the film would be very different without the soundtrack. And years ago, when I was watching quite a frightening film in the cinema, I put my fingers in my ears so I didn't have to hear the music because I was scared. It was a zombie film. And I don't watch zombie films often, but I was forced to go to it. And I realised that actually what was on screen was a lot less threatening without the music. And so every time I felt frightened during the film, I put my fingers in my ears. Sometimes I closed my eyes and put my fingers in my ears. And then my companion jabbed me in the side and said, "Are you asleep?" One of the things also about seeing an orchestra live is that you get to see how the different instruments are used in composing a score to a film. So what I wondered was, when you were watching this, were you paying more attention to the film itself, or were you paying more attention to the actual orchestra playing? And at what points did you start paying attention to the orchestra?
Well, we were quite fortunate because when we bought our tickets, they were up at the very, very top. And when we went to go to our seats, they're like, "Hey, we have tickets lower down." So we're like, "Score." So for 09, we were down a little bit lower, but still was at the
technically the stalls.
The stalls, but so we were up a little bit, and so I could see the orchestra and the chorus that was there, and I noticed I was watching them much more and seeing, how they would sway the violinists and, and to see the drumming and the horns and the trombones, and I was watching them, and their emotion, what they were putting into the music, I could feel it, and then it was like, oh, I need to watch the film, and then I'd be watching the film. Oh, I need to see what they're doing, So I was going back and forth. But for Beyond, we got tickets down at the very lowest level. So I really couldn't see as much as the orchestra. I saw the first row, and that was it. And the chorus, and I noticed I was watching the movie more. And I sort of felt like, oh, I'm missing out. And I almost had wished that we didn't get such good tickets right down on the floor, because I couldn't see it. But I was very grateful to have that upgrade.
It's interesting. It's true. I think the seats we had today, we could see more of the kind of strings because they were, right at the front. But you couldn't see the kind of brass instruments. And that was a shame. I think that's true. I mean, I sort of felt like it's very hard not to get sucked into the film, though. That's why I still felt like you sort of feel you're at the Royal Albert Hall, you're kind of attending a concert, you should be focusing on the music. But more and more I felt my eyes were being dragged upwards because I wanted to see what was going on the screen and kind of get sucked into the film. And then every so often you think, oh, hang on, I'm meant to be, appreciating the music. I better, check out what they're doing. But I think definitely it does add something just to see, the number of people, for a start, that are involved in an orchestra that size, all work, again, this kind of theme of working together. You do get that sense of these kind of people all, putting everything into it and really, as Clara said, really adding something that, obviously is there in the film, but at the same time, it does take that music to kind of complete the puzzle somehow. And if it wasn't there, it wouldn't be the same film. And it did start me sort of thinking, because these films, compared to a lot of earlier Star Trek, they are very fast-paced, they do have a lot of energy, they have a lot of kind of forward momentum. Actually, that music is probably providing an awful lot of that. And yes, they might be edited quite fast and they might be, directed in a certain way and they're quite kind of flashy and showy and, we all know about the lens flare and so on. But the music itself is providing a lot of that kind of propulsion that is really, driving the movie forward. And I don't feel I was as aware of that before as I was, literally seeing the musicians doing that job on stage live.
Well, when you talk about the size of it, I didn't know how much was involved. At the very end, we have the conductor come out and he points to the certain people and then you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, the horns, the French horns, the trombones, and then we've got the pianist and the drummers and he's pointing out all these people and you're like, every part played an important and integral role into building this entire orchestra. And when he's singling out each part, it's like, wow. And just sort of adds to the theme of, you cannot break a stick in a bundle.
He's the captain,
Yes.
Standing in the central position with his kind of thing around him and, directing everyone to do what they know how to do. It's weirdly appropriate somehow.
Very much so.
I just want to add something about the music of the last 3 Star Trek movies, and that is the consistency from the composer Michael Giacchino. And unlike other Star Trek movies which have gone before, they've all had a different, with the exception of James Horner, each and every, he did Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock. But
I guess Jerry Goldsmith did First Contact, Insurrection and Nemesis.
Yes, he did, but each theme was different and
But still closely related.
No, but I get your point. I totally see what you're saying. That these 3, the music it's not exactly the same, but the theme is the same. There is now a reboot Star Trek.
Michael has definitely woven his own sound and his own theme into these movies, totally identifiable. Don't ask me to hum it. No, seriously, don't ask me to hum it. I might just start humming it now. For me, the piece of music that was the most emotional today, apart from the end theme, which I spoke about, is the entry into the Yorktown. The track is actually called Night on the Yorktown. And it's a completely different set piece, incredibly romantic, incredibly versatile in its melody, and it just sends you. And it sets off the beauty of the Yorktown space station, the magnificence of the architecture, and how the Enterprise just comes to space dock inside the planet. Not a planet, it's a planetoid, it's a thing. Starbase, that's it. But instead of having these starbases where the ship docks outside externally, now it's an integral part, almost like a giant train coming back into the station. Incredibly moving. But that piece of music sends me over the edge every time.
I felt, another moment that kind of struck me that again was on a, maybe slightly quieter, you talked about a romantic moment, but actually one of the things that really made this film work to me right from the get-go is that scene. There's the kind of montage of everyone going about their jobs on the ship. And I think that's one of the things that maybe has been missing from the Kelvin films up to that point. And again, maybe partly from having Simon Pegg involved and having that kind of slightly different attitude is, one of the things that is very charming about Star Trek, and, Amy, for example, you're very into the Next Generation. I'd say this is something that particularly came in from the Next Generation onwards, is the kind of sense of everyone just going about their lives. This is their home. This is where they're kind of, they're doing day-to-day stuff. It's not all about the action and adventure. And obviously this is an action-adventure film and it gets into the action pretty quickly. But at the same time, for that short kind of montage, you do get a sense of, time has passed, the days have been ticking by, people have been getting on with their lives. Well, exactly, there's been romances, it's kind of in a very short, probably like 2-minute sequence. And it is basically a montage with just music over the top, which is something that, again, you notice because, you're watching these musicians playing and that's where the sound is coming from. It kind of conveys quite a lot in a short period of time. And again, the music has to be sort of instrumental in doing that.
Interesting you talk about that point, because when I went to the Beyond early release in LA, and they gave us this sneak preview, and it was that clip at the beginning that they showed all of us fans before the movie was ever to come out, and it was that clip that solidified in my mind, this is going to be a Star Trek movie. Like, we're getting back to what it is. We're the day in, day out, we're out in space, we're traveling. So I still remember that clip, viewing it on Paramount Studios in LA with a bunch of fans and saying, oh my gosh, this is exactly what Star Trek needs to come back to. But again, I don't think that clip would be as powerful if we didn't have that origin story in 09. That we've seen them in 09 into darkness, go through these trials, and them coming together is because we have the history and the context of 09 and Into Darkness.
Coming with us to the Star Trek concert today, we brought along a number of people who aren't traditional, I call traditional Trekkies, perhaps maybe people who've come to it slightly later than the rest of us Trek FM podcasters, or people who are not podcasters themselves. So we managed to bring along a bunch of relatives and friends, and one of those people is my husband, Mr. Ben Cook. And he felt like he had a few words to share about Star Trek Beyond and about the experience at the Royal Albert Hall.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'd say one thing is probably echoing Tony's words, was the fact that the music really touches your emotions, the human connection, and that really struck with me a chord right at the very end of the film, where you had that traditional, I'm not sure of the tune, but the very sort of iconic sort of traditional music that you hear at the end of the film. And it was when the choir got up and started to really, link in with the orchestra. And for me, that was quite a poignant moment in the film. I think the only other part which I'd probably factor in was really linking again to what was just discussed about the sort of the daily mundanity of life. And I really like that kind of contrast to then suddenly leaping into a real burst of action. So it was just, it was quite interesting to see how they did that. And I hadn't really thought, as Duncan was saying, around the fact that the music is really enhanced in that point. And you're sort of drawn to the orchestra again. So just I'm picking up on points really that from the discussion that were really interesting.
So you have actually worked at a major concert hall in the past. So you actually seen audiences enjoy live orchestras with other films, such as like The Jungle Book and Disney movies, and including there was a big Star Trek concert at South Bank, the Royal Festival Hall, a year ago, 2 years ago, which was like the Star Trek: The Ultimate Voyage. So is this a trend, do you think, that's going to go forward, where we're going to actually see big science fiction films, or indeed actual other Star Trek films, released again in concert halls with live orchestras? Is this the way forward? Because to get more people to go to the cinema and watch these films?
I think there's definitely an audience for it. It's one of those things where I think you really have to have the buy-in of the orchestra. And it sounds like, from what Simon Pegg was saying, there's a lot of work pre-production and a lot of effort that needs to go in. So I think, a real fundamental aspect of the success of this type of music and audience interaction, I think, will be the orchestras really supporting it and embracing this new type of format. Because I think I'm not sure, it's debatable, but I think it's quite a new format, and maybe it's only been around for maybe 5-6 years. So I'd say it very much depends on the orchestra, the conductor, and how much energy and effort they want to put into this, as opposed to more other artistic programming and things like the classics that will always be a dominant part of any classical programming, year to year.
Yeah, so you very much have to have the buy-in of the conductor and the orchestra, don't you, really? Because without them being enthusiastic and playing to the, basically with passion, it doesn't, then you're just watching a film in a different context than a cinema. So I think particularly with the conductor, so I went to see Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets live at the Royal Albert Hall last month, and the conductor came out and spoke to the audience and got the audience to react to the film and react to them during the performance. So without the conductor and without the orchestra really being passionate about playing to the film and being passionate about the actual subject, whether it's Star Trek, Harry Potter, or another one that's going to be at the Royal Albert Hall is Jurassic Park, that kind of thing, then I think you would literally just be watching a film in maybe a slightly less traditional context than a cinema. I would also like to introduce you to Susan Eldin, who is a dear friend of mine who I've known since I was a child, and Susan and I are big Star Trek fans together. She came along today to the concert. Susan, what did you think of it?
Thanks, Clara. I've never tried to string a sentence together before with a microphone, so I'm not sure how this will go. One of the things, or characters, I was really struck by was Jayla. Because I found by the end, I was but I was really invested in her and as interested in her outcome as everyone else is. I mean, we know everyone else is. They're all going to survive and grow old together, and that's lovely. But yeah, I thought she was great and really relieved that she didn't turn into a love interest, even if it was maybe hinted at, and it will come, probably, maybe. But it didn't happen. She was obviously really strong, very funny. Her tech was brilliant. Yeah, I was really glad at the end to see that she looks like she's going to be an ongoing character, is the glimpse that I gathered with the Starfleet entry. And what a exciting way to move forward with, we've got this set of obviously really established characters, and we've got someone new in there. And I was also thinking about that actress, what it must have been like for her joining that cast and crew 3 movies in, joining a well-established group, and then how that was echoed in her role as well. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing how she'll develop.
Well, funny that you bring her up, because I was one of those, maybe the only one it feels like, I didn't like Jayla. But it wasn't until this viewing that I felt like, wow, she is an integral part of the crew. I felt like it was for the first time I'm seeing this, and I'm like looking at how much Scotty is depending on her. And it really struck me. And I'm telling you, I saw the movie at least 8 times in the theaters. I saw it live at the world premiere. Like, I've seen this movie so many times, but it wasn't until this viewing where it really felt like Jayla was a part of the crew. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but I really saw that in like her interactions with Scotty and how much that the crew needed her and that she needed them, obviously. So interesting you bring that up. So yeah, now I'm not opposed to her coming back. She's in Starfleet, so let's see her again.
Yeah, she does continue to help the Enterprise crew once they hit Yorktown. So I actually noticed that this time, that she was continuing to help them and support them, and she was trying to save Yorktown. She has no real buy-in there. I mean, she doesn't come from Yorktown, she doesn't know anyone in Yorktown.
She could escape.
She could escape, yeah.
She reached her goal,
yeah, but
yet still continued to help, yeah.
And one of the moments that I think is most touching in the entire film is that look of relief on her face when the Franklin actually leaves the planet and she's finally off the planet. Her single goal that entire time, and she probably has been there for years, is to try to get off that planet where her whole family died.
The scene where she sees, through the little window or whatever, and the orchestra is a little bit quieter, and you can see that, and you feel, wow, she's reached her goal of leaving this planet. It's amazing.
So one of the reasons why I think they might have put her in the movie is because there is this trend in science fiction now going forward of having more female characters, especially more female characters who have more agency in action and aren't just romantic characters. So they're not just like a foil for the main hero. They're not just a love interest. So they put her in Star Trek, and I think a similar way that they put like Rey in Star Wars. But I think sometimes it can appear quite obvious that that's why filmmakers are doing it. They're trying to hit a certain audience. They're trying to appeal to young women. They're trying to maybe be quite politically correct. But with Jayla, it felt very different. It felt like she really was part of the story. And I think part of that is the actress's performance, but I think also part of it is Simon Pegg's writing and the fact that he gave her some very amusing lines to say. And some of the lines that she says are kind of the lines that I think the audience is almost thinking. You know, some of the stuff that she says, you know, this is ridiculous or whatever. She's sort of viewing the crew like we're viewing the crew from outside. So it's not like Kirk looking at a problem, it's Jayla kind of like us as the audience looking at a problem. So yeah, she's a great character.
And we have another new fan today who came along to see Star Trek Beyond live orchestra for the first time. And this is Lesley, all the way from Dublin. And she has a few things to say.
Hi, I loved her strong role model. I loved her high kicks. I loved her sexuality. I loved her individuality. I loved her strength of character, which is bringing a new dimension. She stands alone, and yet she's a team player when she's pushed to it. So from the very first moment she comes on screen, she's hot. And the very last moment as she exits, she is seriously hot on the camera. So the high kicks, everything about her, anyway, to the strength of her character, individuality, and the template of what she raises the bar to the modern woman. So the modern woman is not going to hop into bed with Scotty on the back of the bike very quickly. I think she just has that unique, it's my ship. But she's prepared to bend, she's flexible. And then it's wonderful towards the end where you see that she's embraced as a team player. And that moment where her eyes, look down on the badge and you realise that this is the moment. So I go with you. She's one to watch. One thing that I noticed, we have Beyond that came out in 2015. Yeah, so it's 2018 as we are recording this. I cannot believe it's been that long. And what I noticed was seeing the scene where they get off the Yorktown. We have Sulu pick up his daughter. They go arm in arm. And I'm like, do you remember the huge debacle that came because of that arm-in-arm walk-off with Sulu, and his mate? Like, it was so huge. And now watching it now, especially after Discovery, after watching it with Hugh, Culber, and Stamets, like, it isn't even a point to talk about anymore. And I just... After that short amount of time I was watching it and all of those memories came back and I'm like, everyone was so upset. And I just think it was a beautiful scene. I thought it then and I thought it now. And I'm just glad that we don't have to talk about it because it's just a scene now.
Yeah, it's also nice the idea that some of them have families and like what Duncan was saying earlier about seeing the relationships amongst the crew. I think what you're getting is a more rounded picture of Starfleet officers, perhaps maybe than you were getting in the other films, the earlier sort of Kelvin films. You're getting a sort of more of a complete idea that this is a community in space. These are actual people that have lives, they have partners, they have children, or they have lots of different jobs on the starship as well. So it's quite interesting. It's a film, so you can't show all of this in a series like you could with Next Generation, which you can with Next Generation, or with Deep Space Nine, where the character you get to know the characters' likes and dislikes, their problems, their conflicts, because you've got a serialized television, so you've got more time to tell the story. So what they've done with Beyond is try and show that in short segments. There's a flash of like an alien. The camera sweeps by an alien on Yorktown, so you get an idea there's different types of aliens in Yorktown. At one point, during the sort of end of the film, where there's a battle at Yorktown, there's actually like peril and danger. You see a whole bunch of Vulcans come out of a lift. And I noticed that this time. I was like, oh, it's Vulcans running, coming out of a lift. And, I mean, they could have easily just have done that a lot cheaper with a whole bunch of extras just dressed as humans, or just as humans. You wouldn't dress as a human if you are a human. But instead they're putting background people in costume, and they're making background people be sort of like legitimate characters, if you see what I'm saying. And that's kind of what Sulu's husband and daughter is. When he goes to see them, or he comes out of the Enterprise when it's docked, and he sees them there, she's carrying a little toy Enterprise, and that's also a really great touch. You can see that her father works on the Enterprise, so they bought her a toy Enterprise. There's little details like that add colour to the film, and add colour to the background, add colour to the I guess you could say, the Star Trek universe without having to spell it out in a storyline or without dialogue.
I was thinking during that scene when he walks off with his daughter and his partner, aren't we so lucky that we can revisit these characters from decades ago where at the time they were doing their best, but we know now, yeah, you did a lot, but there was still a long way to go. And we can revisit those and like put right what once went wrong, to quote another show. And obviously that does upset a lot of people, but like for me it felt like a really wonderful opportunity and like, I don't know, really moving. I found it really moving.
And I think there's still some way to go with some elements. So the fact that they had Idris Elba as the baddie and the weird accent, you can kind of think, well, and I think there was some debate around that at the time. People were saying, yeah, you know, it's a bit wide of the mark. Yeah, so
sort of like the frontier alien is the savage, right? The uncivilized savage.
Yeah, so I was going to talk about that, like, because there has been such the controversy about Takuvma and how he speaks Klingon in Discovery, and then we see, you know, Kral here, and I'm like, oh, he's speaking very broken, and it's like difficult. Oh, sounds like Takuvma. So it's not the first time that we've seen this, you know, and I found that an interesting parallel there.
Yeah, I did. That did all cross my mind as well, and I wasn't sure where to put it. But yes, I guess when I said, oh, we've come a long way and realised a lot of things weren't good enough, obviously we've still got a long way to go. And it's sometimes I was going to say maybe sometimes it's hard to see when you're in the present day what you're doing that's not cool. But actually, there's often a lot of people who know it's not cool, and if we listen to them, we'll know. Yeah, that was a bit tricky for me at the end too.
One of the issues for me is that Star Trek movie villains have never been very good, and whenever they have a villain in a Star Trek movie who has a single-minded purpose, it's always a hole in the plot, because most villains who have one single purpose and aren't that complex, and you're only seeing them for about 2 hours, are just not very authentic or realistic, and it can be open. You just question like what exactly does Crawl really want, and you kind of got a gist of what he kind of wants, but he also, I mean, I guess he's like a madman, really, isn't he? And most of the villains that you see in Star Trek movies are not that well drawn. I would say that that's probably the weakest part of most Star Trek films, except with the exception of Khan. But then that's because Khan is already established in the original series, and you know, so I feel like Khan is more of an established character. We have a little bit more of an insight, and for him, he has actually got more of a legitimate, like, I wouldn't say legitimate, he's obviously a madman, but he's got more of a sort of easily understandable, no, Amy's shaking her head, or maybe not understandable, but you know, he's got more of a purpose, I suppose. The one film I like the most, well, one of the films I like the most of Star Trek films is The Voyage Home, and there is no villain in The Voyage Home. The villain is humanity, because humanity is the people who have led to the extinction. Well, they've helped to create the extinction of the humpback whales, which is basically what's causing the probe to destroy the Earth. So, and I think that's kind of got one of the best messages of all the Star Trek movies, you know, about climate change and protecting species of animals and thinking about how we treat our world and how we treat each other and that kind of thing. And there is no villain in that. There's no villain in that. So I would argue, well, I would question any Star Trek movie or any big science fiction movie, actually, which has these crazy madmen type villains. I think that's like the weakest part of the whole story.
So when you said the whales, I went to the Natural History Museum. And there, at the very top, huge skeleton of the whale. And as you read through the plaque and just realize that numbers have decreased significantly. I mean, we're talking 100,000s down to hundreds. And the first thing I think of is The Voyage Home. And I'm like, oh my gosh, here's this whale. And they're extinct and we have to save them. The Voyage Home. So funny you bring that up.
Should mention that the Natural History Museum is pretty much right next door to the Royal Albert Hall, which is where we saw the concert today. So Amy is getting a very good tour of the sort of southwest of London. Thank you for joining us today on this little impromptu podcast show here, Primitive Culture. coming to you live from London in a variety of different locations. It's been an absolute pleasure to have Amy come over from the US.
No, I am so excited. When I decided to come over here, I'm like, can we all get together and can we record like a primitive culture? And here we are doing it. It is a dream come true. Thank you so much, Clara and Duncan. Thank you.
And thank you also to Tony for coming all the way from Guildford. Any English listeners will know that isn't too far, but it's far. It's a train ride.
I have to say it's been a pleasure to be a guest here on Primitive Culture, and I love these crossovers where the hosts of the various podcast shows get together. We've all got our various viewpoints and what we see and take from Star Trek. It's all different, so it's lovely to jump in the melting pot and add our views, what we see and what we get from Star Trek. So great.
And a big thank you to our guests, my long-suffering better half, Ben, and my dear friend Susan, and Tony's partner Lesley, who came all the way from Ireland. So it's been fantastic talking about Star Trek Beyond and watching it with a live orchestra. But it's not the only thing that's been happening on the network this week. Here's what you might have...
Elsewhere on Trek.fm.
It's a collaborative effort.
Previously on Trek.fm, the 602 Club.
I think that while I agree he's not malicious, and I hesitate, it's hard to call him evil because he seems like such a... Zahn does a really great head game of constructing this time on an Imperial ship where you have to continually say to yourself... It's almost like, honestly, watching John Smith at home in The Man in the High Castle. You see this guy if anybody hasn't watched it, it's an alternative history thing based on a Philip K. Dick novel where in this alternate history, the Axis powers won World War II. And so...
Coming soon to a 6 o'clock near you.
Oh, yeah. I love the show so much. But one of the mind tricks that show does with you is you meet this one character where you have to continually remind yourself he's working for the bad guys. Stop giving him so many breaks.
Earl Grey.
But I wanted to actually do some humming and singing of my choice, if that's all right with you guys.
Please take it away.
So what I thought of it was I fell into a burning ring of fire. It went down, 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 and the flames went higher. I just love that song. I had to sing it.
To the journey!
You compared the mind meld to notches on a bedpost. Why can't I compare it to trench coat flashing?
No, I'm saying it's not like that. It shouldn't be like that. You're the one saying it's like that. I'm not at all.
But if you're doing it, that's what you're doing. You're seeing how many people you can mind meld with, and that's notches on a bedpost or trench coat flashing. That's what you're trying to do.
It just seems like such an efficient way to get knowledge and experiences from other people.
You know what's more efficient? Assimilation.
Yes, it is.
So what's stopping you from going that next step?
Because we're talking about the Kess era here. We don't have 7 of 9 yet,
Continuing mission.
So you were in the second episode.
I was in the second episode.
And at that time, it was no longer Star Trek Renegades, it was just Renegades?
Well, when I got on the plane to go down to be on set, it was Star Trek Renegades. When the plane landed, CBS had released fan film guidelines.
Okay.
And so they had already shot one day as Star Trek Renegades with Nichelle Nichols and Walter Koenig, Cirque Lofton and Tim Russ doing some green screen work, and they had the uniforms, the ears, the badges, all that. And then they had to shut production down for a day. They tried to get a hold of lawyers talking to lawyers saying, what do we do to continue or not continue?
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps. and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation at the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, that's Babel, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We are Primitive Culture and we are your hosts. My name is Clara Cook and you can find me on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC. My co-host is Duncan Barrett and you can find Duncan on Twitter at Barrett's Books. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. Now I'd like to express a big thank you to our executive producer, Amy Nelson. You can find Amy Nelson on the Earl Grey podcast on Trek FM. So thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended all right.